So I was supposed to have the snippet of Rodney King, but I'm assuming most of you are familiar with his classic statement on race, can we all just get along? And for the historians in the room, you may want to know that this was not his statement. It was provided to him by his lawyer thinking about capitalizing on the moment and later on doing a movie or a book. Anyway, so his statement became emblematic of the post-racial ideal. Let's all be happy, stop talking about race, and everything will be all right. Today I will explain why we cannot just get along. My general answer to the question is that we cannot just get along because we still live in a society partially but profoundly shaped by white supremacy. To make my case, I will, like in the movie Fast and Furious, far away at 8, let me see if I can do this. Yeah, at 8 racial things. And you have the agenda there, and you have my cartoon. So when you're black and Puerto Rican, you have already 2 strikes. So you have to have plan B, plan C, plan D. So this is like plan F. Yeah. So the first thing I want to do then is define racism. Some of you might have heard me before, so there's nothing new here. But everywhere I go, I have to begin here because the more I talk and listen and pay attention to what is going on, the more I realize that we still lack a structural understanding of racism, yeah? So when whites and non-whites talk about racism, they're talking about different things. For most whites, racism is the KKK, or more recently, Cliven Bundy, the Nevada rancher who said that blacks were better off during slavery picking cotton, or Donald Sterling, former owner of the Clippers, who told his girlfriend not to pose in pictures with blacks or bring them to games, yeah? Hence, white's definition of racism is something like the irrational beliefs some people have about the presumed inferiority of others. And I have to confess that we in the social sciences are not much better. That is sort of the definition that we have, yeah? Slightly more jargon, but it's basically the same definition. This definition, I believe, is too limited and does not allow us to appreciate that racism is structural. It's part of our social structure, it's systemic, and we all participate in it whether we like it or not, in conscious and unconscious ways, and in passive as well as active ways. Not surprisingly, we all develop interests that fit our racial location in the order. Some defend this interest and some fight against the system. This more structural definition of racism is the one most people of color have in mind when they think, talk, and debate about racism in America. So those of you who have been in the discussion with white folks, you know that it's like the beginning is there will not be any communication because we have totally different views of what racism is all about. The second problem with conceiving racism as a psychological quirk or as the overt behavior of some actors in society is that we miss a lot of the racial affairs happening before our own eyes. As I will argue soon, the bulk of racial events and behaviors nowadays are subtle, institutionalized, and apparently non-racial. And this is easy for me to discuss in a campus because that's the kind of coin that you transact out there. Yeah? No one is a racist at Brown, but racism is part of the landscape every day. Yeah? Therefore, I already see some people looking like, yep, sounds right. Yeah? Therefore, white conceptualization of racism is ultimately self-serving, inadequate, and ideological, by which I mean it helps sustain the notion of America the Beautiful, where racial issues are, as we love to say in universities, yeah, isolated incidents. And of course, as a social scientist, I know that if we have an isolated incident today, tomorrow, the next day, then there is a pattern, and therefore, it cannot be just an isolated problem. Okay. The second thing I want to address is the character of the post-civil rights racial order that we have. I have argued that the dominant practices responsible for racial inequality today are part of something I call the new racism. And if I had to do it all over again, I would have not used the term new racism. But I did this 20 years ago as an assistant professor. Some of you may remember the pain, yeah? So you had to negotiate the language of the moment, yeah? Anyway, and by this I mean the racial order that emerged in the late 1960s and 70s, which has all but replaced Jim Crow racism, yeah? These new racism practices tend to be subtle and apparently beyond race. This new way of reproducing the racial order of things emerged in the late 60s, and for more details on this, yep, I had to sell the book. Let me give you a few specific examples of new racism practices. We all know that residential segregation was maintained in the Jim Crow period through racial terrorism, housing covenants, and please check out point 8, citizens' councils in the South, and neighborhood associations in the North. Whenever people talk about the South and they keep telling you about the citizen councils, always remember that the North developed a similar practice, yeah, to police neighborhoods. This connects with Professor Shapiro's talk today, yeah? As well as the active participation of the federal government, which, among other things, certified racist lending practices such as redlining and built highways that made possible the construction of white utopia, suburbs, yeah? Nowadays, in sharp contrast, residential segregation is achieved in a suave way through new racism-type actions by realtors, regular whites, cities, and banks, and other actors. For example, the authors of a project titled The Civil Rights Project at Harvard, and the title was More Than Money, noted that, and I quote, affordability alone cannot explain the existing pattern of segregation in Massachusetts, and added, the main reasons for continued segregation include steering by realtors. So any of you who has been in the housing market knows that realtors don't want to talk about race, but when you ask them something like I did, I want to live in a mixed neighborhood, no, we don't talk about race. We're beyond race. We don't have mixed neighborhoods. We only have neighborhoods. I'm like, really? This is in Durham, North Carolina, okay? One of the most segregated cities in the, no, we don't have that. Anyway. So you have steering by realtors, subprime loans given disproportionately to blacks and Latinos, and a lack of action by the area's cities and towns. The 2006 report by the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston indicated that their black testers experienced discrimination 50% of the time. 50%, yeah? The report told of one black tester who was advised that the apartments she had seen were not available until January 1st. When the white tester went, the apartments were available immediately. In another case, a Latino tester and a white tester both emailed an agent and left voice messages. The white tester received a return email immediately, including photos of available apartments, and he made an appointment to see it. The Latino tester is still waiting for a reply. Is this discrimination? Well, we know there is discriminatory treatment here, but most of us don't go with the tester to all kinds of transactions, yeah? But if you go to a court of law and you say this person discriminated against me because he did not reply to my email, hello? Okay. So all these practices exemplify new style discrimination because they are hard to detect and even harder to label racial. How can one prove discrimination by banks, realtors, or renters? Time does not allow me to go further, but similar practices have been documented in other venues and areas of life. And I have to say one personal one, yeah? So I don't walk with a sign saying, please do not discriminate against me. I'm a black Puerto Rican professor at Duke. I got some money, leave me alone. No, I navigate life like a regular black person with a Latino accent, yeah? An accent that you all need to appreciate because this is the accent of the future in the nation, yeah? So all your kids and grad kids will talk like me. Take that, yeah? So what happens when we go to fancy stores? And now that I work at Duke, I can afford to go to Nordstrom from time to time. Either I'm ignored, and like, hey, I'm looking for this. No, you don't look like you have money, so you know. Or are monitored in a creative way, or I'm assaulted by excessive politeness, yeah? May I help you? No, I'm just looking. May I help you? Still looking. May I help you? So now I go by the rule of two. First time, nicely. May I help you? Just looking. Second time, may I help you? Yes. I'm trying to steal this fancy coat. And I was wondering if you could, Okay. Okay, so third, let me talk about police brutality and the new racial order. Police brutality is part of the new racism, and given the attention that it's receiving lately, I have to state for the record that it is not new, and two, it is not on the rise. It is as bad today as it has been since 1968. We may be more aware, in part because of social media, that it's happening, but it has been part and parcel of what happened when the new racism order was established. Police surveillance of black and brown communities became part of the mandate of the police in the post-civil rights era, as Manning Marable argued in his important book, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America. Contemporary racialized policing is racial control, and is mostly invisible to whites, and is done to us, yeah? Whites do not see it or experience it, which explains why many are shocked, yeah? When they see videos of things such as the murder of Eric Garner, albeit not so much in the cases of Mike Brown or even of Trayvon Martin. Many of us have had this discussion with our colleagues who tell us, well, the Eric Garner case is amazing, but the Mike Brown, wasn't he a criminal? And come on. I also want to mention, perhaps to stir up some controversy, that minority officers are not much better than white officers in terms of police brutality. The Ferguson Department, which is 95% white, will not necessarily do better for black and brown residents than the NYPD, LAPD, or my own Durham Police Department, headed by a Boricua like myself, and doing a lousy job, yeah? For some, this fact is evidence that police brutality is not about race, but not for me. The racial training and blue bonding of police officers explain why officers of color tend to follow the white party line in policing. And on this, the work of Phil Goff at UCLA, Devon Carvado in the law school at UCLA. UCLA is the bomb, by the way. And of soon, one of my students, Austin Ash, who is investigating the NYPD and how they police, yeah? Okay, let me move to the fourth point. What is the nature of contemporary racial discourse, or what I call colorblind racism? I will not say much on this matter because I believe many of you have read, hopefully, have bought not a used book, but a new copy of the book, or heard about my work on colorblind racism. In my book, I argue that the nasty discourse of the past has been, for the most part, replaced by a more civilized prejudice that I label colorblind racism, by which I mean, okay, I now have to show it, yeah? By which I mean the new dominant racial ideology anchored on the abstract extension of the principles of liberalism to explain racial matters. And here comes the subliminal message, yeah? I told you, Black Puerto Rican, I ain't got time to be subliminal. The central frames of this ideology are minimization of racism, cultural racism, naturalization, and abstract liberalism. And for time's sake, I will only illustrate one, the case of abstract liberalism, which I think is the central column of this ideology. And in this frame, white folks explain race-related matters with the language of liberalism in an abstract and decontextualized way. By doing so, they appear reasonable, even moral, while opposing all practical approaches to deal with de facto racial inequality. So for example, Jim, a 30-year-old computer salesperson from a privileged background, explained his opposition to affirmative action as follows. I think it's unfair top to bottom on everybody and the whole process. It often, discrimination itself is a bad word, right? But you discriminate every day. You want to buy a beer at the store, and there are 6 kinds of beers. You can get from Natural Light to Sam Adams, right? And you look at the price, and you look at the kind of beer, and it's a choice. And a lot of that you have laid out in front of you. Which one do you get? Now, should the government sponsor Sam Adams and make it cheaper than Natural Light because it's brewed by someone in Boston? That doesn't make much sense, right? Why would we want that or make Sam Adams 8 times as expensive because we want people to buy Natural Light? Use this quote all the time, precisely because I love seeing people say, so, well, that's why we're here, to deconstruct this seemingly non-racial statement. And I'm going to suggest that it's a deeply racialized statement and expresses the way we talk about race in contemporary America. So Jim assumes that hiring decisions are like market choices. You choose the most qualified person, yeah? In this case, the best beer, yeah? So the problem with Jim's view, a view shared by most whites, is that labor market discrimination is alive and well and affects Black and Latino job applicants anywhere between 30 to 50% of the time. We even have research showing that you don't need to show up to experience discrimination, as the work of Diva Payer now at Harvard shows, yeah? Secondly, although Jim believes that, as do most whites, that jobs in America are awarded in meritocratic fashion, and after we had George Bush as president, the notion of meritocracy should have disappear completely. But we still think that we have a meritocratic society, yeah? But anyway, in addition of the George Bush case, 80 to 85% of jobs in America are through networks. You get a connection, and that helps. Of course, that doesn't apply to the academy, yeah? We know better, yeah. So therefore, by upholding a strong, strict, laissez-faire view, hire the most qualified, while ignoring the impact of discrimination in the labor market, Jim can safely express his opposition to affirmative action in an apparently race-neutral way. So this is the way we talk about race. You don't need to mention it and be overt and be vulgar to defend your racial interests. But ideologies are not just about ideas. They are also about the style, the verbal strategies we use to manufacture racial statements in public in a period where the norms of what can be said about race in company have changed. In the book, I uncover 5 component parts. Semantic moves such as, I'm not a racist, but some of my best friends are Black. I don't know their names, but I know they are some of my best friends, yeah? Projection, Tyrone should not be here. He probably feels bad. Eduardo should not be the chair of sociology because he doesn't even speak English. I'm good. Diminutives, yeah? I'm just a little tiny bit concerned about affirmative action. I hate affirmative action, just a tiny bit, yeah? Avoidance of racist talk, and the example I will give you of rhetorical incoherence. Rhetorical incoherence refers to people becoming incomprehensible when addressing racially sensitive subjects. A good example of how this works is Ray, a student at Midwestern University, who was extremely articulate throughout the interview, but became incomprehensible when discussing whether he had ever been attracted to people of color. Hey, wait for me. So to answer that question, no. But I would not ever preclude a Black woman from being my girlfriend on the basis that she was Black. You know what I mean. If you're looking at it from, the standpoint of just attraction, I think that, all women have a sort of different type of beauty, if you will. And I think that, for Black women, it's somewhat different than white women. But I don't think it's, it's nothing that would ever stop me from I don't know if that's, that just sort of be my impression. It's not like I would ever say, no, I'll never have a Black girlfriend. But it just seems to me that, I'm not as attracted to Black women as I am to white women for whatever reason. It's not about prejudice. It's about sort of whatever. Just sort of the way, I see white women as compared to Black women, So I think I don't need to explain this. Yeah, this person was having a lot of problems explaining his position. Yeah. And this is part of the drama of color blindness. I'm colorblind, but I'm not attracted to white black women for whatever reason. But it's not about race. It's just that it is, it is what it is. It is. Okay, I got more in the book, but I have to move on. If you thirst for more on this, you know what you need to do. Okay, the fifth issue that I wanted to discuss was, let me say something about regular white folks and racial control. So now is going to get serious, and some of you get angry. Anger is important in life, so okay. Although racial orders always develop specific forces and actors in charge of maintaining racial order, that's the business of keeping us in our place, yeah? I firmly believe that all whites and honorary whites are deputized as agents of racial control. During slavery, poor whites, the largest segment of the white social group, a group much in the making then, yeah, had to be incorporated into the racial order. During this period, the white majority was asked and paid for to serve in patrols, help capture enslaved Africans who left the plantations, were hired as overseers in plantations, and received some level of social honor by virtue of not being enslaved. They also were relentlessly hammered with white supremacy ideas by pastors and politicians alike. By the time Jim Crow came around, whites congealed into a racial group, yes, internally stratified by class and gender, but a group nonetheless, and developed a much clearer sense of their racial interests. Not surprisingly, they enforced the racial etiquette of the system. The classic book by Charles Johnson, Patterns of Negro Segregation, is a must to understand this, yeah? And many participated actively in brutal forms of racial control, such as lynching. You cannot look at a picture of lynching without understanding that the white masses were part of the event. It was carnival, yeah? The pictures where they're posing, yeah? And taking souvenirs by taking parts of the person being lynched, yeah? Anyway, besides lynching, they participated in citizen councils, neighborhood associations, etc. So defending Jim Crow was defending the small but real material wages of whiteness, privilege, access to education, jobs, housing, and other goodies. But what about today? Do regular white folks participate in reinforcing the racial order of things? My answer is yes, they do. And at the risk of angering some here, let me outline several ways in which they do. One, by patrolling their neighborhoods and streets to help them remain mostly white. I live in a fancy community. Whenever there is a black invader, we get emails. Black person around, yeah? White folks invade all the time, and I'm the only one sending emails. Hey, it's a white dude. I don't know, And they all know the person. Oh, no, this is Kathy. She's running for a marathon. I don't care. She ain't paying. Let's kick her out, yeah? Equality. Okay. Second, by keeping people of color in their new place in jobs, yeah? So we can then talk specifically what kind of things they do in jobs to maintain racial order, yeah? By endorsing and espousing ideas that support the racial order of things, by profiling black and brown people in stores, streets, everywhere, and most obviously, by supporting the actions of the racial state, including, but not exclusively, police brutality. Check the survey data on their views and our views on the Trayvon Martin case. For us, it was like 90% of us were like, this is a clear case of murder by the police. For whites, only 33% believe that. Okay, need to move on. Let me talk about race in the academy. Homo academicus is a peculiar beast, or perhaps, like all beasts, fails to recognize its own business, yeah? We study how social structures produce social collectivities such as class, gender, and race, and how those collectivities operate in ways that tend to line up with their interests, yeah? Yet we seem unable to apply the same analytical rigor to our business. Like romantic idiots, we think we're immunized from racism, elitism, and sexism. But since this belief is a fantasy, every now and then we have race, class, or gender-driven explosions in our colleges, and occasionally in our professional associations. We must always appreciate a crucial organizational fact of our academic homes. Most of us work in HWCUs, historically white colleges and universities. And these are institutional spaces that are historically, demographically, curriculum-wise, symbolically, and culturally white. Despite this basic fact, we conduct our business as if our colleges were neutral sites, not shaped by race or class or gender, yeah? Let me provide three, and I can give you 100, but just three, examples of the many, many ways in which race matters in the departments we work. Race works as kinship, fictive kinship, yeah? Whites form a fictive family, and as such, mesh together in a web of group affiliations. They help one another, teach one another the ins and outs of life in grad school, socialize, etc. This, I argue, is one of the fundamental reasons for the differential records of white and non-white grad students, as well as faculty in sociology. Yeah, this was for the sociology department, but it applies to all of us, yeah? And of course, some of you are thinking, but you folks, you people of color also hang out, yeah? Yes, we're also a fictive family, but our resources and position in the system leads us to have lesser outcomes because we don't control the system, yeah? Second, sociologists of color are formally part of departments. Some of us may head departments, yeah? But like in the polity at large, we are not emotionally embedded. We may be citizens of our departments, but in a deep way do not belong, and often, if not always, are made to feel that exclusion. As grad students, we're seldom incorporated in projects, asked to work with professors, encouraged to rework our papers in seminars for potential publication, told how smart we are, included in study groups, or invited to social events. And a lot of the exclusion happens in the informal networks of power, where decisions are usually made. Albeit we need not be friends with white colleagues and thus get invited to their birthdays, movies on Fridays, and the like, if these racialized friendships and the networks they create lead to power in the organization, not being invited to these events and or spaces has serious implications. So I share a department, and often I go to have a vote, and the decision has been made already. So my job is just to tally the vote. Okay, let's vote. 20 against 1. Faculty of color are seldom hired through open searches, as these work in practice as white searches. So for every targeted search that ends up hiring someone like me, there may be 5 or 6 open searches. So therefore, here you have an inequality mechanism that needs to be addressed, yeah? Since no one is willing to talk about how race affects the record and productivity of white and non-white sociologists, most sociologists of color are deemed objectively as lesser candidates with lesser records and are rejected objectively early in the process, yeah? The few who get through tend to be the minority superstars from top departments, and even they, well, you should hear the comments that I've heard by elite whites about minority superstars when they are alone. I used to get these comments. Now I'm the enemy, so they don't tell me. But early on, I heard comments about all of them, about Wilson, about Hill Collins, even about Bobo. So no one is safe from the white gaze. I can talk about white promotion, microaggressions, but I have to move on. So how will race matters look like in the near future in America? I am pessimistic about our future because racial stratification is becoming Latin America or Caribbean-like, which, believe me, it's not a good thing. I come from Puerto Rico, although I was born in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. That's the accent from Bellefonte, yeah? I'm not kidding, I was born in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. Anyway, I have argued that racial stratification is becoming more complex and producing a new racial formation with 3 major groups. I call them in my recent work racial spaces because they don't congeal as groups, yeah? So, namely, the collective black-brown majority, the middle group of, I call honorary whites, comprised of certain individuals from all the people we call today people of color, yeah? And at the top, the usual suspects, whites. But even the white group, no surprise to anybody, is changing, yeah? It's incorporating a few more people into their team, yeah? It's actually becoming Latin American-like because it's becoming slightly phenotypically darker, yeah? Okay. The emerging system is also relying more than ever before on colorism to allocate individuals into the three spaces. The new order, I believe, is blurring somewhat racial lines, blunting the us versus them dynamic, empowering honorary whites as agents of racial discipline. Think about Jorge Zimmerman, yeah? So George Zimmerman, Latino. Grandmother or grandfather black, yeah? Yet, as an honorary white, he got, I mean, think about how many things he did before he finally was incarcerated. Yeah? This guy could hit everybody, you know, drive 100 miles per hour, never arrested, yeah? Anyway, fostering a more nationalistic ideology that we in Latin America know very well. We're all Americans, we're all Puerto Ricans, we're all Mexican, or in Obama's language, I don't see a black America or a white America or a Latin America. I only see the United States of America. And now that he's president, he can use his good health care and check his eyesight. Because if you don't see a black America, a white America, et cetera, he has some problems, yeah? So we're also experiencing the rise of the neo-mulattoes to formal but not substantive political power. This is what a scholar calls multiracial white supremacy. Obama, for instance, as I have written elsewhere, was vetted by the plutocrats in the Democratic Party. Actually, I wrote in the Donkey Party, and allowed to become their presidential candidate because of his neoliberal economic politics, his post-racial stand and persona, and they loved that he was so articulate, yeah? And because he was not truly part of social movement politics, yeah? I know some of you will object to this and argue that Obama finally is taking a more progressive stand, yeah? But let's be absolutely clear that no matter what you think about what he's doing vis-a-vis Cuba, et cetera, on the race front, he has not done jack. For example, in the middle of the Ferguson-inspired racial protests, he did not do much and said precious little. Not only he advised black people at the height of this recent racial crisis to be patient and wait. Martin Luther King wrote an essay on that. Why we can't wait, yeah? So he asked us for wait for the legal system to process matters. But when he met with young black and brown activists in the still very White House, he let them down by not offering race-based policies, yeah? He gave them hope. Hope doesn't feed people. Okay. Let me conclude by saying, what is to be done to slay the dragon of modern-day racism? We are at a historical juncture of immense proportions. The new racism and its ideology of color blindness, complicated by the emerging racial stratification I just discussed, is producing a more formidable racial regime. Just travel to Mexico, Colombia, Puerto Rico, Cuba, et cetera, and you'll realize that in these so-called racial democracies, race inequality is deeper and much more difficult to fight. But all domination generates resistance and possibilities. So my pessimism about the moment has been somewhat tamed recently by the resilience and militancy of black and brown youth and their white allies who have been fighting hard against police brutality. We are witnessing a moment of cognitive liberation among the black and brown masses, a moment where the slogan, no justice, no peace, is ruling the day. I take as positive signs the fact that President Obama was criticized by black and brown youth. Al Sharpton was accused of engaging in corporate activism. Many black churches and their pastors were criticized for calling for peaceful protests, yeah? And that activists throughout of the window traditional forms of organizing. So we, the oldies, that expect people to organize the way we did 20, 30, 40 years ago, we're out, yeah? Let them find their music and their style, yeah? This resistance is opening up, this is a word that we don't hear often, revolutionary possibilities. What if the growing black and brown masses finally join and develop large-scale social movements? What if significant segments of the white youth join once again in this new social movement demanding equality for all now? But there are serious obstacles for these possibilities to come to life. First, there are differences between and within the black and brown communities in America. We know that. Second, college-educated whites are a remarkably volatile segment which can switch sides rather quickly. Third, the most important demographic segment in America, poor and working class whites. This segment is not happy with social development since the late 60s, and we have abandoned that segment. We progressive, we the left, we liberals, we ain't doing jack with poor whites, and we're going to pay for that. Let me then end by quickly addressing the Leninist issue. What is to be done? Theory matters, and I think we need a more robust theory of racial, class, and gender domination that allow us to understand the specific interests of all segments in the polity. That's why Kimberly's here. She's going to settle it for all of us. For my money, on the race terrain, we need to accept that the problem of racism is materially based in the philosophical sense of the word. Hence, we need to first organize the likely people who will fight the power. This said, we also desperately need to do political work with the white masses, which receive some real, and it's the second time I mentioned, some real benefits from the racial order, but who are overall at the bottom of the barrel. So here is that the class-race conundrum needs to be fleshed out. We must organize for raising the minimum wage, taxing the rich, expanding the welfare system, improving and expanding democracy, which I guess was you talked today, yeah? Lowering the cost of health care, and a host of other class-race issues. The conditions for populist class-race politics are ripe. But ripe conditions never lead to actual developments. Without organization, without politics. It is time for us then to return to social movement politics and social movement organizing, rather than continue wasting our time and money with the Republican Party. Neither the donkey nor the elephant have done much for us historically. So maybe it is time that we, the real people, form a social democratic movement to shake up the American order. And if we're going to have an animal to represent our party, let's have a panther or a lion. Will all these things happen, or will they become just unfulfilled dreams? I do not know the answer to this question, but I know what time it is. It is time for action, as the time for theoretical solidarity and progressiveness is over. It is time for all of us to choose sides wherever we are, wherever we labor, and wherever we live. In the wise and precise words of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will.